Let's begin by pouring one out for the post-war order, 1945 to 2025. In the last couple of weeks, President Trump and his yappy sidekick, JD Vance, have sent Europe and other allies a very clear message: you're on your own. Obviously, that's awful news for Ukraine, but for the rest of us too. Can NATO mean anything if its most powerful member is praising its enemies and scorning its allies? Who better to ask about the alliance's future than Peter Apps? Peter, I'm going to start with a quote from General Sir Richard Shirreff, the former NATO Deputy Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, on World at One. He said, "At a stroke, America has demonstrated that it is not a trustworthy ally, so I think NATO is potentially holed beneath the waterline." Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're two slightly different things. So I think one of the things that I think is rippling through the British establishment with enormous implications is that, particularly because of Vance, and don't forget Vance may be the next US president, so we could be looking at 12 years of three successive US.
Have you seen JD Vance though, man? No one's voting him as president.
It's been so fun. I'm just going to be jumping out through the window.
I just don't think anyone's voting for him. But anyway, moving on.
Well, I mean, he's by far the favourite candidate to be the Republican front runner at the next election. And the second thing is, it doesn't have to be Vance. People like Ramaswamy, and I think a non-negligible number of people in the Democratic Party will be taking much more sort of isolationist positions. The thing about Vance that's interesting, though, is because he really looks like he dislikes Europe and dislikes Britain.
Mm.
And the British defence establishment, so these are people who have been, in love with the US military-industrial complex for 8 decades, right, going back to the Second World War, are saying we shouldn't be buying American weaponry. And that means, you mentioned Jeremy Corbyn earlier, who turns out to have been right all along. It means that Trident is suddenly under question, because if the UK genuinely cannot rely on the United States, then whether we should be spending as much of our defence budget as we do on one weapon system that will last for 30 or 40 years and delivers one very specific type of defence suddenly looks in question. And it's not just the Americans. There's also a couple of bits of technology coming down the line that won't make any difference in the next 4 or 5 years, but will in the next sort of 10 or 20, which is quantum computing, which may make it easier to detect big submarines underwater and undersea vehicles. So unmanned submarines with which you could choke something like the Clyde. And that really puts into question whether we should be putting so much money into that one weapon system. If you look at the French, for example, they have air-launched cruise missiles that are nuclear-tipped. I don't think anyone is going to be suggesting giving up the British nuclear deterrent, quite the opposite. But I do think you're going to start to see members of the establishment who would never have questioned Trident beginning to do so, just as we hit that really, really crucial inflection point about what we do about British defence.
So NATO is a product of the Cold War. Do you think it's found a coherent role since 1991, which is also, as it happens, the year I was born? So in a post-Marie landscape, do you think?
I mean, I'm going to be honest. The immediate Marie landscape was quite challenging for NATO. There's a phrase that it's keep the Americans in, the Russians out, the Germans down. It's very much designed for that traditional Cold War world. And after 1991, that was much more questionable, and it got involved as a sort of contractor for the UN in the Balkans. Obviously, it was used as a tool for regime change in Libya, and it got involved in Afghanistan. The invasion of Crimea by Russia in 2014 put it back on the map, and of course, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 put it very much back on the map as the way in which Europe defends itself and the way in which America helps Europe defend itself. And that brings me back to General Shireff's comment. Even if America is going to pull, I mean, the current base case scenario, if you listen to people like Trump and Pete Hegseth, who is Secretary of Defense, the US does not really want to pull out of NATO altogether. It wants to cut back what it's doing, and it would still quite like, I think, to be in charge. One of the differences between Trump and Vance, and it's a very, very, very big difference, is that Trump still wants to be in charge of everything, and Vance really doesn't in the same kind of way. So, as long as Trump is in the White House, you still see an America that wants to be the dominant player and the decision maker for just about everything. The Americans would much rather stay in, but you're seeing this really bad blood developing really quickly. And just how much of that is bluster and how much of it is really sort of serious, I think depends on how you look at it. I think Trump probably has quite an ability to bluster without, some of the bluster is an act. I think that's possibly less true of Vance. I think that's possibly less true of some of the people who are up and coming. I really don't think he likes us very much, and I really think Vance is getting the impression that Europe hates him. So that's a very different environment.
Well, because he's now insisted that when he said some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years, he was not referring to Britain or France, but some unspecified random country. But it certainly didn't sound like that. He clearly does not like us very much.
To be kind to Vance, the reality is worse than that. The reality is that Britain and France have fought wars over the last 20 years, and we've lost them. We lost the war in Afghanistan. The French have just been kicked out of West Africa by the Russians, and that, I think, is one of the reasons why the Americans are extremely wary of seeing the UK and France leading the Ukraine force. Because if we do the same thing and disappear off after 5 years, then the Russians will roll into Ukraine, and the rest of the world will look a lot more kind of unpredictable.
So you're saying you don't think America will fully pull out of NATO, but if it's sort of less committed, do we need an alternative military alliance, which probably includes many of the members of NATO, involving sort of Europe and Canada and so on, that will actually step up and is more united? I mean, your book points out that it's not as if NATO has like a long history of total unity. But do you think that we need a new alliance that runs parallel to NATO without relying on America?
Well, I mean, so I think you've got to think a bit broader. So the greatest victory for NATO ideas, troops, systems, combined arms warfare. So in the 70s and 80s, the US and with it other NATO nations built up much more sophisticated fighting forces to take on the Red Army if they came across the border into West Germany. And the great victory for that force was the Persian Gulf War in 1991. Which would not have taken place in the way it did had the US and its allies not spent 15 years working out how to fight big tank battles in Europe and then doing the same thing in the desert. So a lot of what NATO has done since the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 is to start to think really serious thoughts about how you would fight a war in Europe, and how you would fight a war in Europe with the US military fighting alongside different NATO forces and headquarters that do that. And even if NATO was to disappear tomorrow, that work does not disappear. So, NATO is very good. Well, it's relatively good, certainly better than any other alliance. I mean, it's better than NATO forces have much better ability to fight together than, say, Russian and Chinese forces do. The Americans use very similar techniques to build up their ability to train with, say, the South Koreans or the Japanese. That I don't think is going to go away, and that has created a better ability for European nations to fight together than probably any other selection of nations in the world. The US is, realistically speaking, at the moment, the only country that has the commanders who have the experience to play that whole game at a high level. So the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe is always an American. And that means they always have access to American intelligence and everything else. Could you redo that under Europe? Possibly. The thing that the European Union has got, which NATO doesn't, is the ability to switch economic focus and therefore spend more on defence. So NATO has no ability to say to European nations, oh, sorry, you don't have to worry about the debt ceiling. The European Union can redo its budget rules overnight. And so the European Union is much better than NATO at industrial strategy, building weapons, that kind of thing. So what you're seeing at the moment is the sort of heavy lifting on the defence industrial-based stuff being very EU-led in Europe, and a bit of a row at the moment in Brussels about how much countries get to do that, how much is going to be the EU. And in Europe, you're still seeing the Americans building those systems. But if you look at the biggest NATO exercise last year, it was majority American, the largest single troop contributor was American. This year, there's virtually no Americans in the lead element of the exercise. It's a deliberately European allied reaction force led by the Italians and with a British division at its heart, to show that Europe can do stuff without the Americans. Likewise, Baltic Sentry, which is the NATO operation to surveil cables and undersea pipelines in the Baltic. Built by the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, so Chris Cavoli, top US general, his command team helped build that, but actually, again, it's built entirely of European components. So you are seeing a lot more of sort of trying to show what Europe can do.
And like you said, actually, Vance may be is probably more anti-Europe, anti-NATO than Trump is. But let's focus on the big man for a moment. Since the 1980s, he's been complaining that America is being ripped off by his allies. He was like running ads in the papers complaining about this. And he's obviously got this very brutish transactionalism that he's always talking about. Oh, you, as in the meeting with Lynskey, well, you owe us money and we've done this and what are we getting back and so on. What does he miss about the value of the post-war order to the US? Like perhaps the more subtle quid pro quo that meant, what do the Americans get out of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting point. I mean, I think, the quid pro quo, at the risk of stating the bleedingly obvious, is that, why is NATO a success? NATO is a success because we haven't had NATO was built to stop a catastrophic war breaking out in Europe with the Russians from 1948, 49 through to the present. It's achieved that up until now, 75 years of peace. Our generation, previous generation, my parents' generation have grown up in Europe, and the Americans have got to be top nation for 75 years in a world that was not dominated by a horrific European war, unlike the previous 40 years. I think Trump, to be honest, just sort of misses that, as just doesn't notice that. And I think the perspective that Trump comes from, and I'm doing my second book at the moment, which is on the fight to stop a new world war. And so, obviously one looks quite a bit at Trump and Putin. And the thing that Trump and Putin have in common is that while they're from quite different backgrounds, Trump's father was quite well off and Putin's unquestionably wasn't. They grew up very much in the messy inner city sort of world of where the overlap of business and organized crime is very real. So if you look at Trump and New York real estate and the sort of environment that he was trying to impress his father in, we're talking about a really quite brutish world. And you see that when he's talking about Zelensky, you don't have the cards. The whole thing is like a version of The Godfather. And of course, Putin grew up in a very similar world in St. Petersburg in the 40s and 50s. His judo teacher was almost certainly someone called Leo the Sportsman, who was a mafia hitman. So again, he very much grew up in that kind of world where and both of them, if you look at their quotes about their childhood, they have very similar quotes about needing to be strong. You need to be strong. You can't look weak. You have to stay. Putin was beaten up by you. He got into his first fight and said, "Well, I shouldn't have disrespected the guy, but I've got to be able to stand up for myself." So they both have a very similar kind of tough boy view of the world, and I think that is it misses the the sort of Eisenhower, Kennedy, Reagan sort of additional step, which is you can, by being prepared to fight for the little guy and everyone, stand up for all the democracies together, you create that space whereby you're allowed to, people can grow up in peace and all that stuff can go on without being dragged into a conflict. So I just don't think Trump has ever really thought about that. And, he's very, very self-centered. And the fact that if NATO hadn't existed, then, he and his entire generation might have been dragged into a messy thermonuclear war, I just don't think ever occurs to him, because the stuff he's lived has been really important.
So the US has frozen arms deliveries to Ukraine, but then in his speech on Tuesday night, Trump mentioned this letter from Zelensky, and it sounded like maybe there was going to be some kind of rapprochement. And then on Wednesday, we got word that intelligence sharing had stopped. So it does kind of feel like we're getting jerked around quite a lot here. Is there still hope of the US supporting Ukraine any longer? And if not, what's the best case scenario?
So I think the first thing to understand is that there are people within the US administration who hold very different views on Ukraine. So there are people who really, really feel that backing Ukraine to the hilt is vital, and there are people who feel that abandoning Ukraine is really, really important. And I suspect that Trump quite deliberately is not committing to either of those camps. So one of these, if you read about Trump and his approach to deal making, he often won't make a decision exactly what kind of deal he's going to go for until the last minute when it comes to buying hotels or so forth. So I suspect that is probably still the case here. I think, the US, may or may not sort of pull support completely. I would be slightly surprised if it is. I suspect they will want to try and keep things kind of churning on if they can, not least because it's a lot cheaper to keep sort of leaning in and out of Ukraine than it is to have this battle over Taiwan. And there's an element to which they're trying to sort of make sure that they have this face-off in Europe rather than China. I think the bigger kind of question is, firstly, whether the Europeans can fill the gap and over what time frame. I think the really sort of big question is whether all of this noise is increasing or decreasing the chance of something sort of more catastrophic happening. So that could be Russia moving into Ukraine, 6 months after a ceasefire, clobbering a European peacekeeping force. It could be the Russians rearming after a ceasefire in Ukraine and then coming into the Baltic states. It could be the Chinese taking advantage of chaos by going after Taiwan. And the question at the moment is whether that sheer level of unpredictability from Trump is raising or lowering those risks. And I think, to come back to the Vance point, one of the reasons why I'm not that worried about the next 4 years is I think people think Trump is incredibly unpredictable, and therefore they're unlikely to really risk getting into a shooting war with him. I think Vance is already being a lot clearer in what he would abandon. And therefore, if you're thinking about launching a land grab, whether that's in Europe or Asia, you might be starting to be nudged into doing it in the next term rather than this one. The arguments against that, to come back to points earlier, the technology is shifting. The Americans, Taiwanese, Japanese, Filipinos, Europeans will be a lot more ready potentially for a Russian or Chinese bit of adventurism in 5 years' time, particularly if the Germans are going to arm as fast as they're talking about. Germany is a remarkable industrial powerhouse. If it starts throwing its weight behind Ukraine in a hurry, can it close that gap? And also how much of this new technology can be got into the battle really quickly. So ever since the American Civil War, the majority of casualties on a battlefield have been from artillery. The last year and a half, they've been from drones. So that's a really significant shift in tech. And you can build drones faster than you can build artillery shells.
Well, to throw back to what Marie said, who would have thought we'd be sitting here going, "Come on, Germany, rearm"? Jonn, just to go to the politics of this a little bit, why does Britain love Ukraine so much across the political spectrum? Like, it really is like generally a bunch of freaks. Like Matt Goodwin was coming out against Lynskey. You get a few kind of columnists who are that way inclined. But generally, everybody bloody loves Ukraine.
I mean, I think it's a couple of different things. I think one is, Britain's modern national myth is, we gave up an empire for the defence of Europe. It kind of flatters our ego to sort of imagine that maybe we would be involved in doing that again. It puts us on the right side of history. I think part of it is Zelensky himself is a sort of brilliant underdog story. He was a comedian who sort of accidentally became president and then became a war hero. That is just an incredible arc. And I think we kind of want to be with that. But also, Russia is kind of like a very old enemy, like for the better part of 2 centuries at this point. Like, we've been allied at different points in that. But, right back to the Crimea, Russia and Britain have kind of hated each other. And they're one of the few countries on earth that still think we're important in some way. So I think being their sort of arch nemesis sort of flatters us as well, really.
Marie, how have Badenoch and Nigel Farage, both of whom want to praise Trump, handled this tricky week?
Yeah, I may just leave it at that. I think Badenoch, as ever, just has seemed quite confused. So I think, on the one hand, her heart goes out to Zelensky, and she's really wanted to make the point that, Ukraine is ready for peace and peace must happen. But also she clearly likes Trump. And, and she refused to criticize JD Vance recently. So she's sort of taking every position in none. So I think obviously she gets that, she has to be speaking up for Ukraine, but also I think doesn't want to get fully on the wrong side of, the US administration. So has landed in a very uncomfortable position. Although the thing that, I'm sorry to say, made me laugh out loud. So she spoke to her benchers, I think, recently and said essentially, they should stop tweeting about Ukraine so much. But Badenoch said to others, let's keep cool heads. Like, a woman who has never kept a cool head in her life, like a woman who will always say the first thing that comes to her head when it's not a good idea at all. Yes, I enjoyed that. I think Farage has been arguably more interesting in that I think he's really been misreading the room, which is actually quite rare. And I feel like, I'm obviously not a big fan of the guy, but he's always been quite good, I think, quite cynically sort of realising exactly where he needs to be on the political spectrum, what views he needs to take, etc. I think he's kind of screwed up by essentially kind of, taking Kremlin lines of saying, Zelensky should have worn a suit to the White House, and he said Zelensky was rude, and he thinks Zelensky, was to blame for the talks breaking down in the White House, etc. Oh yeah, but it's literally just all kind of Kremlin talking points from beginning to end, but which I think is not working at all. And actually, I found earlier today that really striking stat, which is that in 2.5 weeks, Donald Trump has gone from a plus 38 net favourability rating among Reform UK voters specifically to -8. So even Reform voters really hate Trump. And I think this is a really rare case of actually Farage completely missing the point.
It's funny that because it's like you can learn from Corbyn over Salisbury. It's just you've got to be. If you say the wrong thing when it's about Britain and Russia, you will get a spanking.
Yeah, although I do think it's worth bearing in mind, if a UK force goes into Ukraine and takes heavy casualties, that will be incredibly unpopular very quickly in a government falling kind of way. If you ask British parents whether they'd be willing to let their children go and fight in Ukraine, only 11% say they'd be willing. And even more importantly, it's only 15% if you say Poland. So the willingness of the United Kingdom to commit troops in a environment where they are dying, possibly dying in numbers considerably in advance of what you saw in Helmand, is extremely low. And I think one of the reasons why the Brits have been so supportive of Ukraine has been a war without consequences. And I think if that changed, that would change extremely abruptly.